The same nebulous thing about bias is now showing up in the peer review process of scientific literature. Let me read. Alrighty. This is not what you'd expect me to be talking about, because you can tell what's on the screen right now is a collection of search results about bias response systems. And as you can tell, if you're looking closely, it might be a little bit small to read, but a number of these are from universities. Like this particular one right here is State University of New York at Brockport, Georgetown University, Colorado State University. This is actually a K through 12 school system in California. This is University of Connecticut, Western Florida University, SUNY ESF. I don't quite know where that is. And it goes on. Actually, you can do a Google search on this and see for yourself. Why am I talking about this right now? Because here's the thing. This is not necessarily harassment that they're talking about with these things. It's not necessarily it's not harassment necessarily. It's not any serious crime for which you would be calling the police. And indeed what the concern is that they are oftentimes giving no definition or very limited definition of what is meant by a bias incident. What do I mean? Let's go here. So this is SUNY Brockport's website, right? Here, what is a bias-related incident? The term bias-related incident refers to language and or behaviors which demonstrate bias against persons or groups because of factors actual or perceived, such as race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, creed, age, sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, medical condition, body size, disability, marital status, familial status, pregnancy, predisposing genetic characteristics, veteran status, domestic violence victim status, ex-offender status, and or socioeconomic status. Here's the thing. What do you mean by demonstrate bias, right? You know, these kinds of things. If you're meaning the microaggressions incident, a microaggression or something along that line, well, that's extremely subjective. As much of the research suffers from that most of the responses are very subjective. In the most of the responses to whether or not something that is canonically considered a microaggression is actually a microaggression, it's entirely subjective. There's a whole video on that on this channel. And so this is very nebulous. And why do I bring this up? Because if it's so nebulous and vague, that it's basically could be anything that someone takes offense at, which this is very nebulous and vague to me, as many of these tend to be, you can use it to say anything about anyone, to say that someone is being biased or offending or what have you with anyone. And why does that become a problem as far as scientists are concerned? Well, you're basically saying there can be no disagreement or debate. There can be no constructive conflict, if you will. And that is entirely unhelpful. Hang on a second here. And that is entirely unhelpful to building the respect for viewpoint diversity that there needs to be to have good scientific practice. It's something that's really desperately needed on a university campus, is a building of respect for viewpoint diversity. And I definitely don't think that these things do that. Now, what's the question, of course, is what then do you do about them, right? What then do you do about them? Because, well, like, there's been a number of things that have come up recently, and that's what caught my attention. For example, the American Enterprise Institute, and in all fairness, this is a more right leaning institution for sure, restoring campus free speech by eliminating bias reporting systems. Key points: biggest threats to free speech on college campuses is not the occasional conservative speaker getting shut or shouted down. It's a bureaucratic apparatus that stifles free expression of ideas outside of lecture halls called bias reporting systems. Even though BRSs have been harshly criticized in court, they are proliferating. A recent Speech First study found that the share of colleges implementing BRSs has doubled since 5 years ago. Ultimately, elected state and federal representatives need to decide whether they want colleges to be places where ideas are exchanged freely or where certain orthodoxy is enforced administratively. And they go on here to talk about that. And they cite a number of universities here. With a couple of these adding different things that are a little bit more scary. So, a BRS is a formal system universities use to solicit, investigate, and address reports of bias incidents. What exactly is a bias incident? It's whatever the university says it is. The definition of bias stated by most colleges and universities ranges from an unwanted or offensive speech, jokes, and comments on social media to anything that exhibits bias against another individual. This definition is often unspecified and unspecific and subjective, allowing administrators to solicit reports for a multitude of incidents while keeping students on their toes, never knowing what exactly could get them reported. In fact, bias incident has been defined so broadly at many universities to encompass even regular political speech that cuts against politically correct orthodoxy. Common definitions in this vein include speech that is, quote, motivated by a bias against a person in part because of that person's political affiliation or intellectual perspective, as at the University of Mississippi, and biased expressions that are, quote, based on perceived political ideas at Eastern Mennonite University. Things like that are really scary. Really, really scary here. Because putting in that vein that you should, if somebody disagrees, they're biased about something, or they've committed some kind of subjective microaggression against me, therefore they're biased and I should report that to the proper authorities so they can go take care of this individual that offended me, is a really powerful way potentially to chill speech. Now, admittedly, this has got a couple of universities in it. I looked at one university. Maybe there's something somewhere that's specific. Even so, it's a question of what's right against the First Amendment. Here, and you know, it is a thing to point out that it does have a potential chilling effect, and that's what they're talking about here. 2022, the Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit observed that BRSs chill students from exercising their free speech rights because, quote, no reasonable college student wants to run the risk of being accused of offensive, hostile, negative, or harmful conduct, let alone hate or bias. Nor would the average college student want to run the risk that the university will track her, monitor her, or mount a comprehensive response against her. Scientific research really does depend a lot on being able to express your differing points of view without fear. It requires being able to have many viewpoints to look at a problem, because the goal being the pursuit of the truth. If you're only looking at it from ever one perspective and worldview, you end up with all sorts of problems. You end up with tremendous numbers of problems because you will ignore things that can demonstrate that the thing you thought was true or how you thought that thing worked is not the correct way. Is not correct at all to reality. And as such, chilling speech like that with some of these things and teaching students, that they can't chime up, that they can't say something against a colleague, against a colleague's ideas, challenge a colleague's ideas or anything like that, or they may be accused of bias, whatever that nebulous thing is. That's a problem. That's a serious problem, and I do agree with the assessment of the court here that it would chill free speech, right? And it would chill, part of the reason I harp on this is because colleges are the places where we educate at the moment the next generation of STEM scientists and just scientists in general. As such, the issue is if you're teaching students that we're going to chill speech if you don't disagree, if you don't agree rather, we're going to do everything we can to chill your speech if you disagree with the common orthodoxy or the phrase what is the practical what the common orthodoxy, for lack of a better way to describe it. You really do stifle creativity and free thinking and the innovation that we need in scientific research on a daily basis. Um, and that's not going to be a good thing going forward. And as I do want to show in a second, I think it also has some longer term other problems. Um, and they go on here in the American Enterprise Institute thing to talk a little bit more about it. I don't want to read all of it here. Of course, all of this will be linked in the description for you, so go for it. But there is one thing I wanted to bring up because there are ideas here on what to do about it, and some of it is legislative. And in this, I go back and forth because this comes from the Goldwater Institute. And a while back, they had something I spoke about on this channel that was related. It was a different act they were pushing in legislation, draft legislation they were suggesting to help protect students' rights on campus with regard to freedom to speak and not be censored, and help protect against some of the cancel culture related things. And they've come out with a new piece of language that they want for draft legislation to protect students from biased response systems. American colleges should not resemble a surveillance state, yet, and this is their opinion, not mine, just for the record. Yet, at universities across the country, left-wing activists and administrators have decided to borrow the idea that political dissent is best handled via relentless monitoring, reporting, and, if necessary, discipline. These tactics, now put into practice via campus bias reporting systems, place students in a constant threat of being reported to campus authorities by a peer for any offhand comment deemed sufficiently politically incorrect or intolerant. It is somewhat subjective because that definition of what is a bias incident is so nebulous and unspecific that it could really be anything if a student is offended. This is not the way our universities should function, and the Goldwater Institute is proud to announce the release of new model legislation to defend students and staff from this latest front of progressive cancel culture. Developed in partnership with Speech First, the new, quote, protecting students from bias reporting systems model policy will put a stop to this corrosive new practice by prohibiting public universities and community colleges from operating any such system that works to chill students' speech. Now, this is where I would ask, your kind of questions I would ask. Would you be interested in this kind of thing? Would you think this would be a good idea? Under the model legislation, which state lawmakers across the country will now have a chance to enact, a public university or community college of the state shall not establish nor use public resources to support any office, position, or system whose function is to investigate, threaten disciplinary action, or otherwise punish enrolled students for expressions of speech protected by state or federal law, including but not limited to speech pertaining to disagreements of opinion, political beliefs or affiliations, or perceived bias, prejudice, stereotypes, or intolerance. So that is the question. Things like here. I think this is actually it. I think this is actually the draft. Yes, this is actually the draft legislation here. I did not realize this was here. All in all, in 2 pages. I don't know that I can zoom in any closer, unfortunately, because it's a little weird on me with hits, so I will do my best to read it for you. Following model legislation may be adopted as a standalone language to protect against the implementation of campus bias reporting systems or paired with the Goldwater Institute's Campus Free Speech Act to ensure the protection of students' First Amendment rights, the elimination of restrictive campus speech codes, and the guarantee of due process in any challenge of student expression. Here's what the draft language says. Whereas public universities and community colleges have an obligation to uphold students' First Amendment rights of free speech, and whereas the opportunity for disagreements, differences of opinion, and even heated arguments, unless threatening or otherwise unlawful, are vital to a climate of inquiry. And whereas some universities have recently adopted bias reporting systems, which are defined as formal or explicit processes for or solicitation of reports from students, faculty, staff, or the community concerning, quote, offensive or unwanted speech, including satire or speech labeled as microaggression, that is protected by the First Amendment or principles of expressive or academic freedom, and whereas the use of bias reporting systems threatens to chill students' speech by investigating and threatening student speech on or off campus that is deemed bias, and whereas it is the intent of the state legislature to ensure that no state-operated university or community college is accepting public funding, create, or utilize bias reporting system. Now, therefore, be it enacted by the state legislature. Section 1, public university or community college of this state shall not establish nor use public resources to support any office, position, or system whose function is to A. Investigate, threaten, disciplinary action, or otherwise punish enrolled students for expressions of speech protected by state or federal law, including but not limited to speech pertaining to disagreements of opinion, political beliefs or affiliations, or perceived bias, prejudice, stereotypes, or intolerance. B. Solicit the reporting of incidents of student speech protected by state or federal law, including but not limited to speech pertaining to disagreements of opinion, political beliefs or affiliations, or perceived bias, prejudice, stereotypes, or intolerance. Section 2, provisions adapted from the Goldwater Institute Campus Free Speech Act. Nothing in this act shall be construed to prevent institutions from regulating student speech or activity that is prohibited by law, or investigating or soliciting information about potentially illegal speech, or speech associated with potentially illegal activity. That includes violations of law, invasion of privacy, peer-on-peer harassment, all that kind of stuff. That's not protected by this draft legislation. Good. That's good to know. Good to know. Following persons may bring action in court of competent jurisdiction to enjoin any violation of this section or to recover reasonable court costs and reasonable attorney fees. Attorney General, a person who, in action under subsection A of this section, if the court finds violation of this section occurred, the court shall award the aggrieved person injunctive relief for the violation and shall award reasonable court costs and reasonable attorney fees. The court shall also award damages of $1,000 or actual damages, whichever is higher. Interesting. So you have to put in actual damages with this. A person shall bring action for violation within 1 year, so statute of limitations. The state waives sovereign immunity and consents to the suit in state and federal court for lawsuits arising out of this act. A public institution of higher education that violates this act is not immune from suit or liability for the violation. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. I'm not sure what I make of that. And I would ask some of the legal minds, if you're watching this channel, to give a comment. I'd appreciate it. So my point with all this is not to say I necessarily agree with this. I want to actually, because I just found this, I just actually want to read it a little bit more and think about it as potential option draft legislation wise. And for those of you who are more invested in legalese and what have you, and drafting of legislation, I'd be curious to know your thoughts on it. But my point in all of this is that the issue with bias response systems is that they do chill speech. They do chill debate and disagreement and what have you, such things that are really extremely important for scientific research, to be able to debate and disagree and talk with somebody without being accused of bias or whatever that nebulous thing means. And why I get so concerned with it being pushed on our up-and-coming generation of scientists in training, if you will, is because of things like this. So, if you saw that, I tweeted about this the other day, actually, American Geophysical Union Special Collection on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. For the record and recall, the American Geophysical Union is the largest professional society of geoscientists in the world. Many young scientists get their start here. I certainly did. I attended a number of AGU meetings. Though if you saw me online, I've actually let my membership lapse with AGU, in part because I'm very aggravated with the direction they're going and be more interested in advocacy than in science. But there's a point that I want to make here, because the same nebulous thing about bias is now showing up in the peer review process of scientific literature. Let me read. Following the AGU's Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Plan, AGU journals are implementing changes to foster a more equitable and inclusive scientific publishing environment. This includes proactively working to eliminate the influence of bias in peer review, improving diversity and inclusion within our editorial teams, editors, reviewers, and authors, and our publishing processes and policies, and ensuring our publications' content fairly and inclusively represents people and communities. This living special collection presents editorials, commentaries, and research articles from across AGU's journals that shine a light on the need for and the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the earth and space sciences. So this whole thing is a growing list of DEI articles from the geosciences world, or from activists in the geosciences world, perhaps might be the better way to describe it. But my main point here is the first part of this: proactively working to eliminate the influence of bias in peer review. That is a very nebulous word. And based on that, I have no idea what they mean, to be honest. But that could also mean, if I have no idea what they mean, that could mean anything. It could mean expressing something that is mildly offensive to somebody else would be going out the window because it would be captured in peer review and thrown out because, oh, this might be offensive to somebody. And don't think that it can't happen. I talked about it on this channel. Professor Kralov wrote a long article with some co-authors about the Royal Society of Chemistry journals that were implementing a peer review strategy that was quite possibly very censorious, because it would say, oh, no, if it's possibly going to offend somebody, you have to remove it. Is that what you mean? Because I don't know what AGU means. But part of me in all of this is like, this wouldn't have shown up now if it weren't for this kind of influence and things in universities going on with the bias reporting systems and chilling speech that is, I'm putting out there that it's okay to chill speech just because of a disagreement or a perceived bias, whatever that nebulous thing may be. I'm not thrilled about this and what I'm seeing. And I mean, frankly, for me, AGU doesn't represent me as a scientist anymore anyway. Like I said, I let my membership lapse, and that's part of the reason why, is because they just don't represent me anymore. I don't expect I will ever publish in an AGU journal, but we will find out. But this nebulous thing of bias without specific definitions is basically, to my view, just a way to chill speech. I could be wrong, though, and I would be welcome being wrong, so I'd be curious to know what that specific, if you can give me a very specific definition of what is meant by a bias incident or bias in peer review that you're trying to reduce, and how you plan to reduce it. But we'll see. We'll see. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, everybody.